I'm going to give it a second that the Hangout is on air live. All right. So, hi there. How are you? If you
I'm,
haven't, well, I'm not talking to you, Dante.
oh, I'm sorry. I thought you were talking to me.
Shush.
Who else is here?
You're not authorized to talk until you have the talking stick.
I see. Okay. Very
You
good.
don't, you don't have the talking stick, Dante.
Oh, okay.
But anyways, my name's Dan Anderson, and I'm here with Dante DeAngelis, and you may know Dante from Juncess World. You may know him from the Counterparty Project. That's how I know him. You may know me from in the past. I ran a podcast called Unconfirmed Transactions, and also I've been involved in the Counterparty program. And we just want to talk about Counterparty today because it's an interesting time in Bitcoin land, and
It
Counterparty is
is.
this project that's existed since 2013, late 2013, early 2014. Um, and let's just go from there, Dante.
Sounds good. Well, I guess we could start at the beginning. I first learned about Counterparty in the early part of 2014.
Sure.
I did move. I did miss the burn period, so they did a proof of burn. So I came in after that, and my only way to really get into Counterparty was just like anyone else. You'd have to go through an exchange and swap some BTC for XCP.
Okay, let's maybe because I'm hoping that this talk can be focused on what Counterparty is for noobs. So right now, Counterparty is
Right.
basically at an all-time high in terms of market cap. I know a lot of things are at all-time highs in terms of market cap, but there is definitely new people coming to Counterparty, and as we are sort of people who've been involved with it for 2-3 years now, at least, maybe for you it's more like 4. Um, we have maybe unique perspectives that we're looking to get out there.
Okay. Good point.
Because as soon as you start talking there, I feel like somebody who's not familiar with it would get lost. So for me, Counterparty is interesting for the proof of burn or like how it started. It's interesting for what it does, and it's interesting for its path over the last 4 years. Um, so
Maybe
let's
you should maybe you should explain the proof of burn for those who are not familiar with it, because it was pretty significant.
Yeah, so basically that's what I'm proposing is let's focus on that first.
Okay.
So proof anyone that's well, I guess not anyone because this is a proof of work itself is something that takes people a long time to realize, but um, there is a number of different consensus mechanisms in blockchains, and proof of work is the innovation that Bitcoin brings to the table. More and more people are interested in what's called proof of stake. But proof of burn is a concept that was pitched around 2012 as a sort of in between. And the idea of a proof of burn is that you take Bitcoin and you send it to an address where you can prove that no one can access that Bitcoin. So
Right.
you have essentially sunk money into something and proved it, which is kind of like how Bitcoin mining works anyways, where you sink energy in and you get proof that you've done that thing.
And,
So in a way,
and
it's similar.
and you have skin in the game, and
Precisely, yeah.
for a reason, right? So that's good. That's good.
It's a little bit different than proof of stake, where proof of stake is like I can put up collateral, but I can also take it off the table.
Right. 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 Well,
And so that's how proof of burn works. And technically, the way it would work is that a Bitcoin address can be valid, and that the software will accept it. However, you can generate it such that like it's valid, but it's maybe like 1, 2, XXXXXXXXX with a checksum. So that's valid, but to get the private key, because a private key for it does exist, it just to find it is as hard as finding any other private key is.
Right.
And
It would be impossible to, for some, it would be impossible to generate that address and have the private key for it, is what you're basically saying.
yeah, I mean, you create a burn address by basically creating a public an address that is valid, but like the way that public-private cryptography works is you can't go from a public to a private. It's a
Correct.
one-way function. That's the whole deal.
Right.
So maybe we've confused people already. But
Right.
what's cool about Counterparty is rather than doing an ICO, where people who are running the project say, we would like you to give us money and we will give you a token. And now we will control the money that you give us, and we will maybe put some to development, some to marketing, some to bug bounties, and we'll sort of manage that money. Counterparty was interesting because sort of directly in conflict with other projects that were being started at that time around early 2014.
Right.
And for context, for people who haven't or haven't been around as long, early 2014, we're looking at a project called Mastercoin, which is now Omni. Counterparty is very similar. Ethereum at that time was being announced. You have NXT, BitShares. So at that time, there was a lot of interest in these new ways to use blockchains. Counterparty was pitching itself as Bitcoin 2.0. And what the developers of Counterparty did is they said, here's our burn address. We're going to have a period of time, which was 1 month. And if you send Bitcoin to this address, you will receive Counterparty in exchange.
Right.
XCP. And what you get as a result of that is the token is now distributed. Essentially, well, it's more fair than most approaches. The developers don't get a big pile of money that they now have to be in control of.
They could take it. They could say thank you for the money, and not do any further development. I mean, after a lot of these projects, once they've received the funding, they've already been paid. So kind of what happened in this case is none of the original founders received any payment up front, and they had an equal incentive to work on this project like an open source project, just like anyone else who was coming along and wanted to contribute to it. I mean, is that a...
Yeah, so, I mean, the developers could also burn their own Bitcoin, but I mean, they're investing their own money.
Right.
You know, their own skin in the game. It kind of leveled the playing field, and so that's why Counterparty is interesting in how it started, because it's got sort of an ethos to it that says, like, you know, Bitcoin is something that's fairly launched, in that Satoshi, although he did mine a lot, it's not like anyone else couldn't mine.
Right.
He wasn't pre-mining technically, because he announced it, and people just, besides like Hal Finney, people ignored it.
Right.
So they were trying to mirror that. So it's interesting for its beginnings. Now it's like, well, what does it do? And I think we started getting into that a little bit with like Bitcoin 2.0 and stuff. But let's talk a little bit about what it does and why that origination is kind of related to why you would want it that way.
Right. So as far as the things that it can do, I mean, first of all, it's always been ideal for the purpose of someone doing an initial coin offering. And they didn't call them that back then, but there were several. I don't know if they were called crowdfunding at the time or whatever the terminology was, but they did do a lot of that, where a company would propose something that they were going to build, and if enough people had an interest in it, they could go ahead and they could pay them in whatever they would accept, whether that was BTC, possibly XCP. I'm not sure if there were many projects that, you know, took XCP at the time. It may or may not have been. But then what they would do is the beauty of Counterparty is someone could go ahead and log into the Counter wallet and just simply, with no effort, instead of creating some altcoin where they take the Bitcoin code and they start tweaking little minor, they do a find and replace for various, you know, insignificant things, which they call very significant. In this case, all they had to do is create an asset, and that party now becomes it is centralized, whoever owns the asset, but they can make the rules surrounding what their assets would be used for. They could make it let's call that the things that they create from the asset. Those are tokens. Let's just call them tokens, right? That's what they're commonly known as. And they could decide how many tokens they would create. They may or may not put a cap on it and say, that's it. No additional tokens can be created. They can decide whether those tokens would be divisible or indivisible. They can set up a lot of different options. And of course, you do have that party who owns the project, who's running the project, and they're going to deliver whatever it is that they are promising. But no one gets to say to them whether they can or cannot do that project. I mean, from that standpoint, it's decentralized. They don't have to get any approval. And the amazing part about it was all you had to do was take, you know, put a little bit of XCP in your account into an address in the Counter wallet, add a little bit of Bitcoin, very small amount, into that address, and then you click on a button that says, I would like to create an asset. You enter the asset name, and it's that simple. You know?
Yeah, I think people who know a little bit more about Counterparty would follow along. But to just step back, what Dante's talking about is that Counterparty is basically trying to create financial instruments on top of Bitcoin. And so Bitcoin is this immutable ledger, and the transactions that go into this ledger, you know, over time, they're ordered, and you have these transactions, we can all see them.
Right.
There's methods to add essentially additional information. So I can, beyond just sending Dante Bitcoin, I can also, using this Counterparty protocol, which is just which is really just a set of rules that apply to this system, I can, on top of my Bitcoin transaction to Dante, I can also say, you know what, this is what I'm actually doing here, and it's visible to anyone that's using the Counterparty software, is I'm going to create an asset. And so here's my Bitcoin transaction, and then the software that runs Counterparty will see it and go, oh, this person's creating an asset. And it will check the database and say, okay, no one's got that name yet. Cool.
Right.
Okay. It looks like Dante wants to issue Dante coin with 10,000 tokens, and then it's there. And then everyone else sees it. And then now that Dante has a Dante token, he can send, similar to how he created it, he can also send. So basically you could think of the Bitcoin transaction, which is a very minimal amount of Bitcoin, like as small as possible.
Trivial amount, really trivial.
It's being used sort of as a mechanism to carry these messages, and by doing that, Counterparty kind of piggybacks on the security of Bitcoin.
Right.
And
Right.
the word for that people are using is it's a meta protocol or a meta token.
Or a layer two, like a layer on top of Bitcoin. And sometimes the analogy that I would use when talking to people is, the internet basically uses a protocol which is, nobody really pays attention to. We just check our email and, but it's called TCP/IP, and that is the transport, protocol at the lowest level. And then came along the thing that everyone's familiar with, which is the web, HTTP, and that is like a second layer or another layer on top of.
Well, let's talk about the bottom layer that Counterparty
Right.
uses from Bitcoin. So
Right.
it uses Bitcoin addresses as like accounts. So my Bitcoin address is my Counterparty account, and I can, in the software that runs Counterparty, can look at my Bitcoin address, look at my history of transactions, and compute out by reading those that this account has issued these assets and has these balances. And because everything's done as a Bitcoin transaction, well, it's proof that I have the private key to this address. That's my account. I proved it because I'm signing the keys. And we know that no one's tampered necessarily with these messages because they're in Bitcoin, and things don't get into the Bitcoin blockchain unless they're valid.
Right.
It's possible that I can send two counterparty messages, which is two valid Bitcoin transactions, but only one of them is a valid counterparty transaction. And it's just a matter of which one's first. So if I try to double spend counterparty, it's just a matter of which one's first. And so that's also what's useful about using the Bitcoin blockchain is you get this transaction ordering, which is essentially the benefit of proof of work, one of them. But so if you're following along, Counterparty lets you use the Bitcoin blockchain as a low-level transport mechanism, but also it's high-powered.
The security, it has the exact same security that Bitcoin has, because all of the transactions in Counterparty is essentially a Bitcoin transaction.
That's true. And then now that we can do this, Counterparty, they started to come up with some pretty interesting concepts. So like Dante said, you can create new rounds of issuance. So that's a thing that happens often in stocks is, it'll be the founders and they'll be maybe I don't know, maybe there's 10 million shares, but then they take on money and they issue new shares. So that's a thing you can do in Counterparty. You can issue dividends. You can send one Bitcoin transaction from your address that owns an asset, and you can say, I would like to distribute a dividend of Dante tokens. And through just sending one Bitcoin message, the Counterparty software will update the balances of potentially thousands of addresses.
Of everyone who's holding some of those tokens, right?
Yeah. So there's dividends. There's also betting, which is very interesting, is that we can enter into bets that will execute based off of the result of a feed, like a JSON feed. And you have to trust that JSON feed as an oracle, but that allows you to do bets, that allows you to do financial derivatives.
Talk about the way that is done. I mean, there is a tool, there is a feature that's part of Counterparty called the decentralized exchange, which is, we call it the DEX. And
that's separate from bets, but it's I was kind of working up to it, but let's get into it because it's like the crowning jewel of Counterparty for no doubt.
It's a great accomplishment that they it's great creation. They really developed something nice there.
So what's cool about Counterparty is that there is this concept of orders. And if you've ever used Bittrex or Polonius, you're very familiar with the concept of buying and selling. Those are just orders. Or if you're familiar with any, E-Trade or whatever, like you place buy-sell orders, right? And so if I have 10 Dante tokens, but I'd rather Counterparty,
right?
I can broadcast into the Bitcoin blockchain that I am willing to give 10 Dante tokens or Dante coins for 10 Counterparty. I can sign that and broadcast it. And what's kind of cool is that the Counterparty nodes will see that, and they'll now escrow that money. While that order is valid and in the blockchain and not met, Dante can no longer transfer those tokens. It's escrowed.
It's guaranteed to be there.
It's escrowed.
When someone comes along, yeah.
And sure, somebody could run a different version of Counterparty software that has different protocol rules, but that would be out of consensus. And I mean, I'll get into that. But now, if I want to accept Dante's order, I can say, okay, I'm willing to give Dante 10 Counterparty if he gives me 10 Dante coins. So I broadcast my matching order, and now the system sees them, and it goes, okay, these match, and it updates our balances. And so that's essentially an atomic swap on Bitcoin's blockchain.
Yeah,
it's gonna execute.
Mm-hmm.
Like, there's no one to prevent you from doing it, because same way no one can prevent you from doing a Bitcoin transaction.
Right.
And that's huge.
And there's no one that you have to trust to fill that order on either side.
Yeah, it's really nice. And so that's the DEX. The DEX is a literal exchange. And Ethereum people might be more familiar with, I think it's Ether Delta. Like, the concept is demonstrated in different blockchains. But Counterparty does it on top of Bitcoin, and has been doing it since early 2014. I mean, Counterparty was doing ICOs on Bitcoin's blockchain before Ethereum did its ICO.
Right.
It's Counterparty's founders. I mean, this T0 is doing an ICO right now that's Overstock's like blockchain arm. I mean, they were interested in Counterparty very early as well. Like, it's Vitalik Buterin. He says on Twitter recently, he said that his initial conceptions of Ethereum was of a Counterparty-like token.
Right. Well, you and I met in the early Counterparty chit chat. In other words, with the whole community would gather. Actually, it was in Skype. It was a Skype channel, and
Yep.
I recall toward the I think I want to say toward the end of 2014 is probably when Patrick Byrne from Overstock, I guess, became really interested in doing the first iteration that he thought of. He actually, what he wanted to do, I don't know if this is in sync with where you're headed, but do you recall when what he wanted to do was to use the Counterparty technology to basically put NASDAQ completely, to tokenize all of the stock, because then you wouldn't have you'd have the physical stock as a token, and you wouldn't have the fractionalization that goes on, where the amount of stock that they're selling is not necessarily the amount of stock that, you know, that they're actually holding. But that's probably getting a little bit down the road here.
No, I mean, it's the point of Counterparty is to bring financial instruments to the Bitcoin blockchain. It's done that, and to look at it that way, like he was, is correct.
Right.
It's just there are trade-offs with using a blockchain, especially Bitcoin's blockchain. Namely, some of them being Bitcoin fees. You know, to broadcast a Counterparty transaction, you have to broadcast a Bitcoin transaction.
Well, you're paying the miners just like any Bitcoin transaction.
Yeah.
So you're doing it here.
So that is a trade-off. However, you're getting a decentralized, trustless, you know, no counterparty risk, no exchange risk, like atomic in that it's like guaranteed to execute if you match it. And, you know, it's on the premium global blockchain that is Bitcoin. So that there are, you know, fees associated with that is just life.
You know, you want to stay in a 5-star hotel, you really can't complain that the rates are different than a Motel 6.
But here's the other thing that's missed, because I want to drill down on this too. The other thing that's missed about centralized solutions is the risk. So Counterparty is called Counterparty because it aims to remove counterparty risk, which is the goal of Bitcoin's blockchain, is to get rid of counterparty risk.
Exactly.
And so people don't really get the name, I don't think, all the time, but like it's like Counterparty. It's called Counterparty because it's trying to eliminate counterparty risk. And while Bitcoin fees, and again, Bitcoin fees right now are up, but you know, maybe there's just been a fire sale on Bitcoin fees for a long time and it's like over. However, also, it's not necessarily the case that Bitcoin fees will always be going up and up and up and up and up. You know, there's innovations which do often reduce the fees. There's things in the pipeline right now that we're talking about, like Lightning
Network, right?
And the being on the Bitcoin blockchain means that Counterparty gets to benefit from having the most high-class developers upstream,
right?
You know, improving
the
base layer.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because Bitcoin is really being recognized as something that is really rock solid. I don't know who it was that made the statement, you might remember, but I think it might have been Antonopoulos that said that Bitcoin has a huge bounty. You know, it's like it's a very, very large bounty.
Mm-hmm.
You know, to go ahead, you're invited to try to compromise this network because there's a lot of money at stake. And people have heard that for years. They may have been doubtful, and they watch it and watch it, and year over year over year, you know, it just keeps chugging along, no matter what anybody throws at it. And there have been a lot of bad actors that have tried to throw, you know, problems at the Bitcoin network, and the honey badger doesn't give a shit. It just keeps going.
I'm with you. One of in the early days of Counterparty, someone did find, and I'm talking about very early days, somebody did find a bug which allowed them to get their hands on some Counterparty. That bug was fixed, but since then, I don't know of any cases. I mean, that work, because for example, a Counterparty multisig is a Bitcoin multisig.
Right.
It's funny. It's funny to see Ethereum where they talked about smart contracts for so long, just to have everyone interested in making tokens. And their multisigs are getting hacked and stolen. Whereas in Counterparty, like no one's ever had their multisig hacked because it's a Bitcoin multisig.
It's a Bitcoin address. It
just doesn't happen.
For the longest time, when people were being introduced to Counterparty, and I've been talking to people about it, for quite a long time. I mean, we've been doing meetups in Florida since early 2014, and we had a lot of people that would come along, and their primary interest might have been Bitcoin, but they would end up learning about it more and more, and in fact, what some of the uses could be, et cetera, et cetera. And one of the ways that it would be described is a Counterparty literally is Bitcoin. I mean, it has extra features. It does certain things that Bitcoin does not try to be,
Yeah, for me, I've heard that said before. It's not something I necessarily am a proponent of, because I know that the security model of Counterparty is distinctly different from Bitcoin. Embedded consensus does have some issues, which are known and enumerated. Like, because there's no proof of work in Counterparty. Counterparty, you're putting messages into Bitcoin
Right.
transactions, and those Bitcoin transactions are protected by the proof of work. However,
Right.
the data you're adding for Counterparty is extra. It's like not validated by Bitcoin. It's in Bitcoin, but it's not validated by Bitcoin.
Correct.
And so these federated nodes that do validate it,
Right.
that's the Counterparty system. There's no proof of work there. So the consensus is less strong. We saw this in Omni, which used to be Mastercoin, with Tether. Tether recently, something like $30 million was like strangely issued when it shouldn't have been.
Right.
And then what Tether did is they went right to the exchanges and said, update what you consider valid. And so there are trade-offs, but the reason I bring it up is because, like, if you know the trade-offs, like, you know the trade-offs. I don't think we need to hide them. But what's also really interesting about Counterparty is it's kind of like a sidechain, but like it's somewhere between a sidechain and not a sidechain. So I think I'm sorry if I'm just going on a little monologue here. So
No, that's fine.
But Counterparty is in a way kind of like a sidechain. In early 2014, people were even like suggesting it should be a sidechain. So like Matt Corallo, in 2014 on Twitter, he said that, Counterparty should just be a sidechain, so we don't have to argue about the op return. There was a big debate about spamming the chain. It's funny now because, like, turns out you get spam anyways. So like Counterparty is useful spam if it's spam at all. And then there was like Peter Todd in 2014 was suggesting that like it'd be good for the SEC to like stop this non-IPO, which is the burn, so that Counterparty would be forced to do a sidechain.
Right.
Some interesting things there. In a way, you can think of Counterparty as a one-way pegged sidechain. Sidechains, as conceived by Paul Storch, if at the end of the day, what a sidechain is, in his conception, is a database entry. Like that's what Counterparty is. It's database entries.
Yeah.
I mean, his conception is different in that like there's this two-way peg. But what's interesting about Counterparty to me is that this two-way peg thing that people are trying to do is hard. It's very hard. Whereas a one-way peg, where we burn the Bitcoin, we get these Counterparty tokens, which we can consider like a sidechain token.
Right.
And rather than it being pegged in that we can like one for one go back and forth, instead we can just trade it, and there's a fluctuating market price. So you can do that on exchanges.
You could always come back. You just have to buy your way back in. And if the markets change, the value of one or the other, it's not a guaranteed one-to-one peg. Is really where you're going.
Yeah, and I think that makes sense. And then you can even buy and sell Counterparty for Bitcoin on the DEX It's a little complicated. It's not a majorly used feature because it is complicated, but
Yeah.
that's the nature of a lot of cutting edge blockchain activities. Um, do you mind if I screen share and we look at why Counterparty did a proof of burn now that we've
Oh
covered
yeah,
that it did a proof of burn,
that would be
that it's
perfect.
that it's like a financial insurance on top of Bitcoin, and sort of that it was 2014. It's um, and just delivering things that people are excited about today as if they're new, but
Yeah.
they're not, and delivering things that some people seek in a sidechain, but doing it like for the past 4 years. And as far as I can tell, sidechains have been talked about for a long time, and they're still years away if they're ever going to be a main part of Bitcoin. So you have Counterparty now. I think, um, I think you know the way Fate has gone, Counterparty did not take off. A lot of Bitcoin or just blockchain projects in general don't take off, but it's something that's been consistently there. It works, continues to work, and I think maybe we're in agreement that the point of these videos is sort of to talk about, take a second look at this thing. What can we learn from it? It's been around for 4 years. Um,
And to that point, to that point, I think there was a period of time where a lot of outsiders were looking at Bitcoin. I'm not saying that they were even looking at it very closely, but they were looking at it and saying, "What? It's like 3 years now. Is that still around?" Yeah, it's still around. It's still a thing. I mean, there are some people that are out there that are normies who like really maybe they don't pay attention to the news or something. I had one person I mentioned it to not too long ago, and somehow Bitcoin came up in the conversation, and he said, "Oh, is that still? Oh, is that still around? I thought that went, you know." So you have those people who are just tuned out and don't really know anything about anything, and then they might catch a few things in the headlines, when J.P. Morgan's CEO makes a comment or something. Now that's what they know. So those are the no coiners, But what I was going to say is you had other people who might have been inclined to maybe do something with Bitcoin, and they're like, I don't know. And they just kind of watch it for a long time, and they eventually see, holy cow, this thing's been around for a lot of years now, and it's functioning, it's working. And then that changes minds. So if that's a good thing, if that is a relevant thing, then it's also very relevant that Counterparty has been functioning. It's been around since early 2014, and it's working. I mean, I guess that's what I wanted to point out.
Speaking of sort of noobs and no coiners, the funny thing about Counterparty is that I think we've described it kind of technically, but like we can also throw that aside and just talk about it with like the financial analogies. So, right now Bitcoin is a CME future. It's going to be a NASDAQ product. Like,
right.
Real deal finance people are aware of Bitcoin.
Yep.
What they may not be aware of is things like Counterparty and the hope of sidechains. But what they are aware of and what Counterparty does: buy, sell orders, derivatives.
It does all of those things.
That's which is kind of like another word for options. Dividends.
Right.
These are just like fish to water.
But imagine these financial entities finally saying, "Hey, this is where we need to move," and they're moving into Bitcoin in various ways. Can you imagine? Yeah.
Let me just throw out because I would like to wrap up the video soon. I'm just looking at the clock here because we're gonna make some more videos. I want to keep them
short.
This is kind of this is kind of introductory.
Exactly.
But we brought up fees. one of the other interesting things about Counterparty is um, similar to how the Lightning Network works, where you pass signed messages that can be broadcast to like closed payment channels, but you do things off chain.
Right.
Similarly, like that can be done with Counterparty 2, where say I want to trade on the DEX, but I'm
Right.
worried that I'll waste like a Bitcoin fee if it's not going to get matched.
Okay.
There could very easily be a centralized solution, and oh, what a dirty word, centralization,
Right.
where um, I sign a Bitcoin transaction with a counterparty buy order,
Okay.
and it's valid, and it's ready. It's just not broadcast, and I can hand that off to a centralized provider, and I say, if you can, someone matches this, if you can find someone to match this, go ahead and broadcast it.
Right.
And so now I am committing to only, and what's the worst thing that centralized party can do with that message? You know, they can only broadcast it, and it'll
And
only do what I want it to do.
exactly. And the other funny thing, and I guess eventually, I don't know whether we'll do it in this episode or we'll do it in a subsequent one.
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of it's really kind of ironic. There's a few things that have been going on. You see people always wanting to see the value of the price of Bitcoin to go higher. They want it higher. When is it gonna when is it gonna moon? And literally, it has been mooning, and that means that the value obviously is much greater. So at the same time that people are celebrating and toasting that it's done what they've been hoping for all along, it just stands to reason. It's kind of like, I guess now you're staying in that 5-star hotel, and you're saying, oh, but wait, I was happier when we only had a Motel 6 in this city.
People just miss their reindeer games. Like, the fact is, like, we lived through like some weird, early phase of Bitcoin and blockchain that was wonderful, but that's just not how time works,
I know.
Um,
I mean,
am I screen sharing now?
Yeah, I see your screen.
So I just want to wrap this up and pop through some things that are kind of like what we talked about.
Can you make that larger or not?
Yes. Is this helping?
Well, yeah, that's much better.
So
That's
I just
good.
this is the initial commit to the Counterparty repo, and I just want to point out some things. So like this is December 15th, 2013, and it says here that Counterparty offers decentralized financial instruments and a protocol build on top of the Bitcoin blockchain. So that is the most succinct first description of Counterparty. Here is the founders' kind of defense of why proof of burn, because it's kind of a new thing at the time and first time it was really tried. And it says here, do I have to make this bigger? Maybe I'll make this bigger too.
No, that's good. Yeah, nice. Nice.
So, like Bitcoin, the Counterparty community operates in a decentralized manner where everyone has an equal say in the project. Counterparty developers do not enjoy any special privileges, and I'll link to this in the notes. The point of having a burn was to eliminate the need to trust anyone with large sums of money while building it and its community. And I like this part the most, maybe. So, establishing Counterparty's legitimacy through proof of burn. Selling off a pile of pre-mined Counterparty coins would have obvious benefits. It would also have created Counterparty as a centralized project, one of many, and set up whoever holds the money from the sale as a potential point of failure. This is against the fundamental goals of both Bitcoin and Counterparty, to do away with the need for trusting any third parties including the founders and developers themselves.
Very big statement, but that's what that is what it was. That was.
So in today's 2,000 plus Bitcoins were burned.
Right.
About that. So something like $35 to $40 million today, and the developers foregoed that money to create a fair playing field and a strong attempt at making a decentralized project, avoiding any weird incentives,
right,
and to really live up to something that was Bitcoin worthy. It
was very.
And and that's and you gotta, they don't really talk about this, but you gotta think they made a way to trade decentralized assets. They made a way to trade to like, you can't stop the trading.
Right.
You know, it's a system where the SEC might not think kindly of it. But the funny thing about Counterparty is that, like, no one got the money. You know, usually regulatory organizations, they like to follow the money.
Right.
But no one got the money here. And so it's I like to think of it as not only a very like ethical and fair way to do it, but it's also like a harm reduction innovation for developers in the blockchain ecosystem.
Right. Well, all of the money went into the bit bucket. It went to, in Unix terms, it went to dev null.
Yeah. And they say, there's other, I'm going to link to them, but they say, like, you know, like, don't cry any tears about these burned Bitcoins, because the value that this could add to the Bitcoin ecosystem is greater than that. And it will maybe even prevent some innovation from bleeding off into other blockchains. I mean, early on, a lot of Bitcoiners, especially the developers, thought they didn't really like Counterparty, but now they're starting to embrace sidechains, and I think a lot of them maybe wish they didn't fight Counterparty so much, because in the end, what you get is 1,000, you know, alternative chains versus something that's trying to improve Bitcoin, even if it's not the same security model that they would like in an ideal world. Dante, any last thoughts? Because I feel like I want to end that for my own point.
No, this is good. I think this is a good place to start. I mean, I think that while we do these conversations, and we would like to stay with the chronology that we can recall, there's going to be a certain amount of slippage, you know, where we skip around, like when you're watching a movie and then it's like, hey, is this a flashback or is this real time? But that's just the nature of things, because the linkage in the memory goes a certain way. I mean, I'm trying to recall, I have this one thing stuck in my head where I remember there was some guy who created some tokens he was just giving away to all of the most recent active addresses. It was kind of neat. It was pretty cool. It was the gorilla token.
That's weird. That sounds clever.
Yeah, it was a clever guy that did it, but you know.
All right, so let's end it there, Dante. Thanks for your time, and I think we'll do this again soon. I hope people find this valuable. Leave a comment below. If you want to get in touch with me, my name is Drop Blister on Twitter. Dante is Florida Bitcoiner.
If you want to send me an email, you can send floridabitcoiner@gmail.com. Or you can find me.
Thanks for your time. Peace out, party people. I'm going to stop it now.